Hello and welcome to our afternoon edition of Arirang News, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Gwon, and it's good to have you with us. Praying for peace on the Korean Peninsula. That was the theme behind the special Mass that took place at the Vatican on Wednesday. It was a rare occasion for the Holy See. The Vatican does not usually perform such services for specific nations or visiting dignitaries, but it signaled how important and urgent the North Korea situation is being viewed. We'll take a further look at it later in the show, but first we have the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Centre. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. In addition to the Mass, President Moon and the leaders of Italy have agreed to strengthen their bilateral ties. They signed an MOU that'll bring about more meetings between the two sides, and President Moon got their support for his diplomacy with North Korea. Kim Yo-sun reports.
An upgrade to the relationship between South Korea and Italy. During his stay in Rome, the South Korean leader inked 3 new agreements with Italy on cooperation in defense, air services, and trade. President Moon Jae-in, holding back-to-back meetings with the president and the prime minister of Italy, worked on establishing stronger ties between the two countries. South Korea's presidential office says the leaders agreed to expand the level of their ties to a strategic partnership while discussing ways to increase their cooperation in political and defense sectors, trade and investments, and science technology. Under the Memorandum of Understanding, the two countries agreed to hold a biannual strategic meeting where they will discuss ways to boost cooperation in the areas of industry, energy, and trade promotion. And the air service agreement calls for joint efforts to up the number of flyers and cargo flights between Seoul and Rome as a way to promote trade and people-to-people exchanges. The agreement for defense ties was not released immediately, with the Blue House explaining it will be made public after the two sides complete their internal reviews. President Moon also urged Italian leaders to support his country's efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula and brief them on his 3 summits with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The Italian Prime Minister expressed his full support for President Moon's diplomatic initiatives on North Korea, adding that denuclearization must be done in a verifiable and irreversible manner. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
There have been concerns among some in the U.S. that inter-Korean relations are getting ahead of the North's denuclearization. But South Korea's ambassador to the U.S., Cho Yoon-jae, gave public assurances Wednesday that Seoul and Washington are working together around the clock. He was speaking at a meeting with correspondents in Washington. He said, in fact, that South Korea and the U.S. agree that the trust built through inter-Korean talks has helped overcome difficulties when North Korea-U.S. talks have hit a snag. Also, Cho said he expects working-level talks between Washington's Special Envoy for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, and Pyongyang's Vice Foreign Minister, Choi San-hee, to be held soon. The UN Security Council has added 3 ships to its sanctions list for engaging in illegal oil transfers to North Korea. The UN's Sanctions Committee says the sanctions will apply to 1 North Korea flagged ship and 2 Panama flagged ships based on resolutions 2321 and 2371, which prohibit ship-to-ship transfers of oil to the regime. The ships are believed to have violated the resolutions in May and June this year. North Korea and Panama will have to deregister the ship's flags, and they won't be allowed to enter the ports of any UN member states. South Korea's foreign ministry has expressed concern and disappointment after a group of Japanese lawmakers visited the highly controversial Yasukuni war shrine on Thursday. The shrine honors Japan's war dead, including about a dozen Class A war criminals. Seoul's foreign ministry strongly urged Tokyo to show humble reflection based on proper historical awareness and to contribute to future-oriented South Korea-Japan relations. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sent an offering to the shrine a day earlier, but he did not go there in person. In its penultimate meeting of the year, South Korea's central bank has left its key rate unchanged, while revising down its earlier growth forecast to 2.7% for 2018 due to rising economic uncertainties at home and abroad. Our Kim Hye-sung has more.
The Bank of Korea has kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 1.5% for October. This marks the 7th rate freeze this year after the bank raised its key rate for the first time in over 6 years last November. The decision comes despite the widening U.S.-Korea rate gap, which increased to 75 basis points last month on the Fed's monetary tightening, and the soaring property prices and growing household debt in Korea, which reached $1.3 trillion and is only slightly less than the country's GDP. The central bank cited concerns over the sluggish domestic labor market, relatively low inflation, and the escalating trade war between the U.S. and China for its rate decision this month. The number of newly added jobs in the country fell below the 100,000 mark for the third consecutive month in September. Korea's consumer price index gained 1.9% on year in September, higher than the 1.4% the previous month, but it remains below the central bank's 2% target. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, remain low at 1%. The BOK added that trade friction between Washington and Beijing, Korea's top two trading partners, is adding extra uncertainty to its export-dependent economy. 김혜성, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the South Korean government has announced stricter loan screening rules for banks to reduce the country's massive household debt, estimated at around $1.3 trillion. The new rules, to take effect soon, mean those with the most debt won't be able to borrow more. Our Korean Hee explains.
South Korea's Financial Services Commission and Financial Supervisory Service announced on Thursday that they're creating a specific standard based on the debt service ratio for what is classed as a risky bank loan. Vice Chairman of the FSC, Kim Yong-bum, said this change, which will come into effect at the end of the month, will help lower the rate of household debt growth.
Although household debt problems are less likely to spread to systematic risks, the absolute size is large and the growth rate is fast. Credit management measures such as the debt service ratio and rent interest ratio should be implemented to further slow down debt growth.
The debt service ratio, or DSR, is calculated by dividing a borrower's annual income by their annual debt repayments, including interest. A high DSR is negative from the bank's point of view. Since March this year, banks have applied their own debt service ratio standards to almost all household loans on a pilot basis. Each bank had a different definition of a risky borrowing, but their average definition of a high DSR was 100%. According to the FSC's new announcement, loans with DSRs exceeding 70% will now be categorized as a high DSR, and banks should limit these to 15% of new loans. And only 10% of new loans will be allowed to have a DSR above 90%. Commercial, regional, and specialized banks will have different limitations. The Financial Supervisory Service is expected to check if banks are following these measures on a monthly basis. Meanwhile, the government aims to reduce the average DSR of commercial banks to 40% by the end of 2021, which is around 10% lower than their average DSR last June. Korean Hee, Arirang News.
The U.S. Treasury Department has decided not to name any of its major trading partners, including China, as currency manipulators, but it is keeping South Korea, among others, on its watch list. China has been accused, especially by President Trump, of keeping its currency artificially low to help Chinese exporters and lessen the impact of tariffs. And the Treasury Department did say this time that China's policies are of particular concern. On the Treasury's watch list, South Korea is joined by Germany, Japan, Switzerland, and India. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
It was a moment of history. President Moon Jae-in addressed the faithful of the Roman Catholic Church from its heart, the Vatican. He assured the attendees of a special Mass on Wednesday that lasting peace would be achieved on the Korean Peninsula, as Shin Se-min reports.
President Moon Jae-in making the most of his time in the limelight to talk about a subject so close to his heart.
오늘 성 베드로 대성당에서 올린 한반도 평화를 위한 기도는 평화를 염원하는 세계인 모두의 가슴에 희망의 메아리로 울려 퍼질 것입니다. 평화를 염원하는 우리 국민에게 큰 힘이 될 것입니다. 오늘 우리의 기도는 현실 속에서 반드시 실현될 것입니다. 우리는 기필코 평화를 이루고 분단을 극복해 낼 것입니다.
President Moon stood on the podium at St. Peter's Basilica during a special Mass for Peace, the first Korean leader to give an address at the event, presided over by the Pontiff's top diplomat, Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin. It's what the Vatican described as, quote, unique and exceptional, as the Holy See very rarely holds special masses for individual countries. President Moon, a Catholic himself, summoned his fellow Roman Catholic Church faithful that amazing changes are already happening on the peninsula, stressing the Koreas are faithfully keeping their promises, the scrapping of weapons and guard posts, and removing landmines from what used to be the world's most heavily fortified border.
기독교와 유럽 문명이 꽃피운 인류애가 시간과 공간을 뛰어넘어 한반도에 용기를 주었습니다. EU가 구현해온 포용과 연대의 정신이 한반도의 항구적 평화를 향한 여정에 영감을 주고 있습니다.
The president asked the Vatican to continue praying for peace on the peninsula, saying he is certain it will be achieved. In his homily, Parolin prayed for the gift of peace on the Korean Peninsula, so after years of tensions and division, the word peace can fully ring out. Next on the president's schedule, passing an invitation from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to Pope Francis to visit the regime's capital of Pyongyang. And as seen from the level of welcome and the first being made for President Moon's visit here, like holding that special Mass for peace, even during this busy week of Synod or a meeting of the bishops from around the world, there's optimism that the pontiff may in fact make that historic trip. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Rome.
Now, to discuss further on President Moon's visit to the Vatican, we're joined by Dr. Hyun from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the Blue House has previously mentioned how rare it is for the Vatican to put on a mass like this, because they don't normally do it for a specific nation or for specific visiting dignitaries. But it seems the Vatican pulled out all the stops this time. They allowed President Moon to give an address after the mass to those who were there, as well as the Cardinal State Secretary Pietro Parolin, who greeted President Moon Jae-in and the First Lady Kim Jong-suk in what was a rather amusing, kind of surprising moment when he spoke to them in Korean during the mass. So, can you tell us, I mean, how special was this mass, do you think?
Well, I think in many ways very special for President Moon himself personally. I mean, we know President Moon is a Catholic, just like First Lady Kim Jong-suk. So for two Catholic faithfuls to be at the Vatican in the St. Peter's Basilica and celebrate Mass and talk about North Korea must have a very profound meaning for the President Moon. So in that sense, it's personally very important. But also we have to understand that in this present tour of Europe by President Moon, I think President Moon faced some pushback to his idea of putting sanctions relief before denuclearization. We know from the statement coming out after the meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron that the European position or French position regarding North Korea was very clear, that this denuclearization should be complete before any sanctions relief takes place. So I think in a way President Moon was facing some reality check, but in Vatican clearly he found a more receptive audience to his idea, so probably it was very important for him.
What does it say about the fact that the Vatican has allowed this kind of mass to take place? I mean, does it show, about the importance of this North Korea situation, not to the Vatican, but the message it sends to the world as well?
Well, the Catholic Church has a very important principles. I mean, I would say two important principles for the Church would be sanctity of life and also peace. So I think both things kind of square in the case of Korea, the Korean situation in the Korean Peninsula, especially with North Korea. We have to remember that there are almost 6 million Catholic faithfuls here in South Korea. So if there's any contingency in the Korean Peninsula, it will hurt the church as much as the Korean nation. So I think in that sense, the Catholic Church has a vested interest in seeing stability in the Korean Peninsula.
President Moon is also set to have a sit-down with the Pope himself later today. And of course, the focus of everyone's attention is that invitation from Kim Jong-un for the Pope to visit North Korea at some point. and there seems to be now growing speculation that Pope Francis will accept. Do you think he will?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this Pope, just like many of his predecessors, is an engager. He believes in dialogue and peaceful resolution of conflicts. He has made many statements regarding peaceful resolution to ongoing conflicts in many different parts of the world, and Korean Peninsula is just one of them. So I think for a Pope to express deep interest in the Korean Peninsula is very important because the scale of the issue. I mean, it involves nuclear weapons, it involves all the major powers in the world, as well as it involves, Korea, which is a very important Christian country in East Asia. So I would say that all the conditions are kind of met when it comes to, somehow bringing interest out of the Pope to focus his attention in the Korean Peninsula.
Isn't there a risk, though, that he'll come under fire for some criticism for perhaps legitimizing the North Korean regime with a visit if he goes there?
Well, clearly there's a risk. I think Pope has been under this kind of criticism before, but then he's willing to take that risk because probably he believes that the upside of engaging North Korea is much, much larger than the downside. I mean, we don't know what's exact calculation that's being made at the Vatican, but then it wouldn't hurt for the Pope to sit down with Kim Jong-un and then somehow open Kim Jong-un's eyes to what's going on in the world, and also bring attention to the fact that if North Korea wants to be seen normal to the international community, then North Korea will have to do something about this horrible human rights record.
So if Pope Francis does accept, how big of a deal will it be for actually North Korea? I mean, what will it mean for their history and their society as well?
Well, clearly, Kim Jong-un is not seeking Pope's blessing for his policy. I mean, he's atheist by default. But then I think he's seeking to get some prestige out of it. I mean, Pope, despite the fact that he's just a religious figure, he's a very influential opinion maker for almost 1.2 billion Catholic faithfuls around the world. So in that sense, counting Pope's support to Kim Jong-un's idea of denuclearization, such as denuclearization of the entire world, entire peninsula, rather than just the denuclearization of North Korea, would actually put a lot of prestige to the Kim Jong-un statement. So it's something that the Kim Jong-un is seeking right now, diplomatic and the political prestige. So in that sense, the meeting with the Pope will be very important for him.
So Kim Jong-un will be getting a lot of political prestige. But what do you think about for the North Korean people? What do you think their reaction will be? How would they take someone like the Pope coming to North Korea?
Well, they took the idea of a South Korean president making a speech to them pretty well. So I think they would probably consider the Pope to be just another important political figure who's coming to North Korea to pay the tribute or attention, respect to the dear leader.
Rather than like a religious leader, you're saying?
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, religion is not really allowed in North Korea. So, I mean, from their point of view, religion is just another extension of politics. So.
Interesting. So, obviously, we'll have to see whether Pope Francis does accept, and if that does, that will be a very historic moment. Now, on Wednesday, President Moon also met with the leaders of Italy. So he had a summit with Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, and they released a joint statement together outlining new agreements on various issues that South Korea and Italy would now be pushing forward with, such as trade and defense, among others. But there's also full support from Conte for President Moon's initiatives on North Korean policies. How important do you think it is to have Italy's support, as well as from other countries on North Korea?
Well, after all, I mean, Italy, even though it doesn't really carry much of a weight in this part of the world, it's a very important member of the European Union, as well as the member of the G7. So it's a very important country in many ways. It's very influential in the international public opinion and the international security policy. So counting on Italian support for the President Moon's policy of engaging North Korea is a very important bonus, I would say, of this tour that the President Moon is doing right now. So I think it's actually definitely a plus.
What was noticeable about this summit, though, actually, was there seemed to be no mention of sanctions during the summit, which you also talked about earlier as well. This comes in stark contrast to the summit with the French President, Emmanuel Macron, where he very much pushed for, talked much about easing sanctions on North Korea, possibly in the future. Do you think President Moon is deliberately easing off on this visit after seeing the reaction from the previous visit? or what do you think why do you think he's eased off on that
Well,
subject?
I hope that President Moon is doing this deliberately because I'm just surprised that President Moon went to, of all places, France, and tried to convince the French to relax the sanctions before the denuclearization. If you remember, I would like to remind the audience that among the European countries that have diplomatic relations with Pyongyang, actually, France is not one of the European countries that has a diplomatic relations with Pyongyang, despite the fact that all other European countries, many of the European countries do. And there's a reason for that, because the reason is because the French actually put priority on human rights situation as well as the denuclearization. And the fact that President Moon didn't take that into account when he was having this meeting with President Macron, it's actually very surprising to me. So I think President Moon probably has some reality check in Paris. So when he went to Italy, probably realized that the Italian reaction to his proposal would have been pretty much the same as the French, because the European Union has a very common, tried to have a very common foreign policy position towards many issues in the world, and North Korea is one of them. So I think it was a very wise move on the part of President Moon not to mention it when meeting with the Italian Prime Minister and Italian President.
Not to pour water on Italy, but as in President Moon will next be meeting with the UK President Theresa May and UK Prime Minister Theresa May, and also the German Chancellor Angela Merkel as well. Do you think he might bring up the issue of sanctions again, especially as they're perhaps bigger players especially in the UN compared to someone like Italy?
Well, he could bring that up. We don't know. But then again, the same explanation applies here, that United Kingdom is on its way out of the European Union. But then Germany, I think, will also, it could be softer rather than the French, because Germans have a diplomatic relations with North Korea. But then I think, the statement coming out of Berlin would be actually measured, but then still quite consistent with the European Union's position towards North Korea, that sanctions is actually an important component of pressuring North Korea to give up nuclear weapons. On the other hand, United Kingdom could be a little bit different. I think the United Kingdom's priority right now is to see, denuclearization is an important issue, but trade is also a very important issue in South Korea. So the statement coming out of London could be also measured. But then I think the United Kingdom, as a member of the United Nations Security Council, a permanent member, and they're also important ally of the United States, will have a very strong position towards North Korea's nuclear issue. So I think it would be wiser for President Moon not to push on that front too much.
This issue of sanctions does seem to be causing some sort of rift. Perhaps rift is too strong a word, but at least pulling on two sides between Seoul and Washington, and that's perhaps best shown by recent statements made by the ambassadors of the two countries. So if I look here, the US ambassador to Seoul, Harry Harris, said South Korea and the US need to approach North Korea with a common voice. That's the words he used. And South Korea's ambassador to the US, however, he said it's not possible for the inter-Korean process and the process to denuclearize North Korea to always be at the same speed. Can one argue that both sides have a point, but can they actually be reconciled?
Well, the both sides clearly have a point. But therein lies the uncertainty of engaging North Korea. We don't know which instrument we have to use first. So I think, both ambassadors' positions reflect that reality, a difficult dilemma that the two countries face when it comes to dealing with North Korea. I think the two positions can be reconciled, but then it's a matter of time. Which should come, also the priority, which approach should come first. And I think right now, the approach of pressure should come first, because North Korea has promised to deliver important denuclearization measures in exchange for having this summit with the President Trump, as well as with having inter-Korean summits. So, but then we are still waiting to hear from Pyongyang what kind of denuclearization approach North Korea is going to take in the near future. So we have to wait for that answer first before we engage in expanding economic engagement with North Korea, or even lifting some sanctions measures.
South Korea's Blue House has tried to clarify the situation by saying that they're communicating very closely with the US, and even including all activities with the North, including the rail and road networks, projects about them connecting and all that as well. But what does South Korea need to be careful going ahead? What comes next, essentially?
Well, I mean, I'm very surprised that the South Korean government's position regarding railway and the road connection with North Korea is actually being discussed deeply with the American counterparts, because that's a very clear violation of the UN sanctions measures. There's it comes out of the Article 7 of the Sanctions Resolution 2397, which forbids member states from lending North Korea help in regarding transportation and then construction materials. That's exactly what South Korea is proposing to do right now. So in that sense, I think even before getting into finding out what kind of American position, what is the American position regarding this issue, we have to be aware that it's actually a very clear violation of the UN sanctions.
Well, that's where we end it. Dr. Gwon, thank you for coming in as always and sharing your insights.
Yeah.
Now that concludes our show. I'll be back tomorrow with more insights and analysis of the day's top stories. Hope you can join us again then. Thank you for watching and goodbye for now.